Welcome to Game Theorem, where we have serious discussions about absurd entertainment.
The Paradise Planet is a bleeping joke. And the miracles are fake. Pure fiction. False. Gamzee Makara, Bard of Rage.
I hate your Gamzee voice.
Not as good as my Caliborn.
No, but still quite creepy.
It doesn't sound high or whimsical or angry enough. I'd have to work on it. Mm-hmm. Anyway, we're talking about Homestuck again.
Yeah, again.
I'm Kyle.
I'm Kira.
And so we've been trying to catch up on Homestuck, and we're finally at the part where we get to talk about Earth C. Mm-hmm. Now, we've spent previous episodes covering Homestuck. We've covered Earth B1, B2. We've covered the troll planets.
Yep.
We've covered the game sessions of Spurb. Mm-hmm. And basically, all of that's to say that when Homestuck concluded, they finally reached the C universe. They got to make their Paradise Planet. Mm-hmm. They got their game reward, all that, right?
Yep.
And that's when the Homestuck epilogues happen, and that's when Homestuck 2 happened.
Yep. And we're going to start going over to that.
Exactly.
Well, we're not going to get through to the epilogues completely, but
we're starting off by telling you the backstory of Earth C. Mm-hmm. Because there's enough of it that we can have a whole episode over it.
Yep, because there's a lot.
Now, it should be said, this part of the story is very much skipped over. Mm-hmm. You don't really get to see a lot of it. You have to infer from the pieces that you are said.
Yeah, because basically what happens is in the finale of Homestuck at the end, they do like pictures, and they show pictures of progression, and you have to infer what happened from those.
Yeah, from the Homestuck credits, mm-hmm. which is then picked up on in the epilogues several years later. Mm-hmm. And so some of this is a bit of, theorizing of putting points together, but there's a clear picture you can make from the information you're given, and we just kind of ran with that. And it's really hard to find a complete history of Earthsea anywhere, so I like to think that that we're bringing this as something new to discuss and talk about.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Honestly,
not as many people seem to be into Homestuck 2 as Homestuck 1, and shame on you, Homestuck fans. I expect better of you.
All right, you want to get started?
Sure, yes. So, Earth C. On November 11th, 2424 of the old calendar, the last of the Spurb players from Earth B2 left the planet behind to play their session B2. The world left behind was flooded, and all of humanity was extinct. The only sapient species left on the planet were carapacians that had been brought there long ago.
One of the Spurb players returned and capsulogged the Earth into her specialized inventory that was capable of holding objects of any size by shrinking them down into a transparent glass ball so she could take the Earth with her into Session B2.
When the Spurb players finally won the game and birthed Universe C, they left Session B2 and entered Universe C. A false star was awarded to them within Universe C that was simultaneously a game artifact and a perfect source of light and heat. The false star was intended to host a paradise planet as a reward for beating the game, and it had text superimposed upon it that said, "Thanks for playing."
Yep. The Spurb players decided to rebuild on Earth instead of getting a new planet, and so they put Earth B2 in orbit around the false star, renaming it Earth C.
So Earth C is actually kind of a continuation of Earth B2. Mm-hmm. The Spurb players then got to work on reinstantiating the planet, but unfortunately they didn't discuss a plan on how to go about doing that. They all just winged it with minimal effort, since none of them was older than 16, and didn't really know what they were doing. One among them, however, was an adult, Mr. Crocker, but he naively assumed the younger players knew what they were doing.
I think Mr. Crocker was just like, I don't understand all this newfangled technology, so I'm just gonna let you kids handle it.
I mean, yeah, all of them are, or a lot of them are gods, right?
Yeah.
So he's just like, I do the strength in the business. I don't know all this
Yeah.
world building stuff.
The Spur players struck a deal with the remaining 8 denizens that lorded over the 8 planets in Session B2, except for Yaldabaoth, who had disappeared in a black hole when his planet had been destroyed. The Spur players ferried the survivors of Session B2, including Carapacians, consorts, and sprites, into Universe C via the portal upon the Victory platform that connected the 2 planes of existence. In addition, the Spur players took a significant amount of alchemy, equipment, Spur technology, and personal belongings from their homes with them to aid in their efforts.
Once they had ferried everyone and everything over onto Earth C, the Spur players closed the door to Session B2 and left the denizens behind to rule over the underlings that now solely lived upon the Session's planets.
The Spur players used their ectobiology equipment to rapidly increase the population of Earth C, and they deployed alchemy technology to be used to meet the population's needs, effectively creating a post-scarcity society. The existing Carapacians on Earth C, as well as the survivors from Session B2, became the caretakers of the hundreds or thousands of new baby Carapacians, humans, and trolls.
While the humans and trolls were ectobiologically created from the genetic material of the Spur players, one of the Spur players, who was a cherub, thought it best that she be the last of her kind, remembering the terror that was her brother.
Year negative 2987, new calendar. Once the population of Earth C stabilized to some extent, the Spur players decided to skip forward to the future after civilization was built by the ectobiological inheritors of this world. And so, at the time traveler's behest, they skipped forward 5,000 years to the future, taking the sprites with them, bidding farewell to a population of mostly Carapacians on Earth C.
The Carapacian caretakers, however, made the mistake of segregating the batches of Carapacians, humans, and trolls. As they matured and sought self-determination, the segregated groups sought to create independent nations on the limited land mass left on the flooded Earth Sea. Adopting Carapacian monarchist philosophies, they eventually founded 4 kingdoms: the Human Kingdom, Troll Kingdom, Carapacian Kingdom, and Consort Kingdom.
Wait, you know that, Jade had Dave time travel the planet further to, get it ready for everyone, right? Because it was flooded, but natural processes on the planet would get rid of the water.
No, that wouldn't happen until the next 5,000 years.
Oh, okay. Okay.
I mean, you could argue that they didn't just travel in time so that civilization would be here, but also so the water would be gone.
I guess.
But people had to live through that era.
I guess, okay.
Yeah.
Since trolls lacked any mother grubs that they needed for their complicated reproductive cycle, the Troll Kingdom had to use ectobiology equipment regularly to repopulate their population, similar to the Carapacian Kingdom, which did that as well, since Carapacians possess no natural reproductive abilities.
That's always an interesting thing that no one really talks about. But
yeah, all Carapacians are from ectobiology equipment.
Yeah, they're all sterile.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we do know that Carapacians can have sex, somehow. But it just seems to be like an intimacy kind of thing. You know, a sterile person can have sex, right? Mm-hmm. And even theoretically, someone who doesn't have... Oh, crap. This is going to be a mature episode. Trigger warnings for stuff. Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
But,
okay.
But yeah, like, you know, even without genitals, you could probably get into some intimate encounters with people. They do seem capable of it, even though they can't reproduce on their own.
Mm-hmm.
One Carapacian, known as the Mayor, oversaw the construction of a place that he called Cantown. He made it to be independent of the 4 kingdoms, and people of all species were welcome. He was then elected mayor, finally earning the name he called himself.
Yep. Since alchemy provided all sustenance and needs for everyone on Earth C, the 4 kingdoms never felt motivated enough to enact war upon each other. But the mayor still resented the tensions created by monarchies and the threat they posed. And so he acted as an arbiter between the four kingdoms to create a unified government to rule Earthsea. One of the queens of the Carapacian kingdom, the Prospetian monarch, was a friend of his, and she abdicated the throne. The other kingdoms followed in suit and formed the Quad Kingdom Pact.
Unfortunately, the mayor's ideas of governance were entirely inspired by books detailing the representational republic of the United States of America from Earth B1. And though they tried to improve upon and update those ideas, they ended up recreating many of the same structural flaws, but with more interspecies relations and card puns. The kingdoms continued to exist largely only as large states, run by the Democratic Republic with three main components.
The legislative branch was a parliament called the House, divided into 4 quarters to represent each kingdom, with an equal number of seats regardless of population. However, within the quarters, districts were proportionally allocated representation, split by multiple political parties, and the number of seats in the House were tied to the voter turnout rate, which led to an extremely high turnout rate for elections. If the turnout rate was close to 100% in a given election, every seat would be filled, making a full House.
Full House, get it, card of hands.
Yeah.
Hand of cards, whatever.
Yeah.
So this is weird. It's like a combination of the Senate and House of Representatives, because it is like proportionally allocated, with the exception of the dividing quadrants. Like each quarter has a fixed number. So theoretically, if one kingdom's like twice the size of another kingdom, that means they get half the representation. The delivery of justice, or DOJ, operated the courts and mail. The former Prospetian monarch was the first to take the position as postal minister that oversaw the DOJ. They interpreted laws, delivered notice of them, delivered all notices, and made sure communication, welfare, and arbitration throughout Earthsea was maintained. Though no proper currency was used on Earthsea, with the government overseeing the distribution of essential goods produced via alchemy, the DOJ issued postage stamps that were sometimes bartered for value anyway and accepted as a pseudo-currency.
The mayor's office was the third component, where the mayor was elected by popular vote to govern as the elected representative of all people on Earthsea. The position held little power and was mostly ceremonial.
Which is probably for the best. That if you're going to have that position, which maybe you shouldn't, but if you're going to have it have little power. Right?
Yep.
You get the feeling that when the author of Homestuck, Andrew Hussey, I think he was the one who wrote a bunch of this stuff, because it kind of has his politics embedded into it. You get the feeling that he thought this was like the perfect government or whatever.
And there are some improvements.
Oh, no, this government's awful. It's like the perfect liberal government, I guess, if you assume liberalism's the correct way to go. Well,
like, for example, tying seats to voter turnout isn't a bad idea.
I mean, it's an interesting idea, but, I mean, I guess it encourages you to make rules that encourage, like, you know, probably everyone has voting day off, for example, right?
Yeah.
However, I still take issue with a representative democracy in the first place instead of a direct democracy.
I know.
Many briefly protested the government's formation for creating such a massive government that would oversee all aspects of their lives, which led to the creation of the Parcel Luggers Union, or PLU, which was a worldwide union that accounted for a majority of all workers on Earthsea. The goal of the PLU was to counter the Earthsea government and DOJ specifically by being a directly democratic organization from the bottom up. So this is actually really good. Like, if we ever want to get out of the hierarchy of our current system, having an opposing force, having a bottom-up organization to counteract the top-down one would be an essential thing to at least balancing the power there. So I do think that's a good idea. I'm not saying that's like the end state, but like that, like it would be cool if we had that.
Yep. However, representational democracy had become so entrenched as the norm for what constituted democracy that the directly democratic approach of the Plu became known ironically as plutocracy.
Well, the PLU, so plutocracy. But yeah, it's a pun on plut, which is not what plutocracy means.
Yeah.
But okay, redefining words here. The Earthsea government existed in this way for thousands of years. The government was extremely stable, particularly due to the lack of wars, squabbling over resources, and capitalism that could lead to upheaval. The people of Earthsea became so confident in the system that they developed an entire field of mathematics to prove how perfect the system was. Which again just sounds like liberal crap of like...
Yeah.
Like, this is not perfect, obviously. Mm-hmm. I think it's just supposed to be like a utopian paradise planet. Mm-hmm. And it's weird to me because the story later goes on to critique this government.
Yeah.
But it does it at the same time with being like, oh, well, originally it was perfect and it just gets unperfect over time. Hussey's doesn't seem extremely consistent in his politics. Mm-hmm. Which is kind of expected for like a leftish leaning liberal, right?
Yeah.
It's like good at heart, but like doesn't really know what you're talking about when it comes to like the actual structure of governance and how there's like inherent contradictions to it. Mm-hmm. I think it's fair to say that, like, you know, one of the characters later on, Dave, says how these people were just kind of playing government. Mm-hmm. That all of their basic needs were met in this post-scarcity society. And so the government was just making sure everyone got those things, and it was more of just kind of, you know, fixing the pipes to make sure it worked efficiently enough. There wasn't like life and death on the scales, effectively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. However, despite the system being so stable, the cracks in the system began to grow over the millennia. People noticed inefficiencies in the DOJ that brought about miscarriages of justice and mail. Two notable political factions rose that wanted to address the injustices: the post-structuralists and the postmodernists.
The post-structuralists argue that the system of the DOJ needed to be reformed entirely so that a more efficient type of organization could replace it and do its duties, while the postmodernists argued that the mail system simply needed to be digitized to not rely on physical alchemized paper anymore. Mm-hmm. I think the post-structuralists were probably the right ones there, because I have severe issues with the structure of the government.
Yeah, exactly. So restructure everything.
Yeah, I don't think just modernizing it would solve it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Meanwhile, the people of Earthsea had a robust educational system. Everything that had happened since the first generation of ectobiological babies on Earthsea was known as history, while everything that happened on previous planets became known as prehistory, which included the prehistories of Bephoris, Alternia, Earth B1, and Earth B2.
I think it's pronounced Bephoris.
Bephoris?
Yeah, like before.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Research and information on all prehistory was hard to come by, except for Earth B2, which was the designated name for Earthsea before it was renamed. Archaeologists often explored jungles, excavated ruins, and examined areas uncovered by the lowering sea level as Earthsea regained its ice caps to learn about Earth B2 prehistory. Unfortunately, most of the finds were hundreds of giant JPEG duplicates of the Statue of Liberty, left behind by one of the Spurb players.
Dave.
No, Dirk. Oh, no, you're right. It was Dave this time.
Yeah.
On Earth B2, yes.
Yeah. In addition to history and prehistory, lore was taught in the educational systems, with lore detailing the story of Spurb and how Earthsea came to be. The Spurb players were called the Creators, and the ones that had reached God tier among them were especially venerated in a sort of secular religion. Relatives and sprite versions of the Creators were respected as well, like lesser figures of myth, but whether mortal, god, or sprite, they were all deemed the Creators.
Yeah, it's a weird thing. It's like, oh yeah, the gods. I mean, it's not a religion because we know they're real. We've seen them.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
However, xenophobia became a minor but noticeable issue on Earthsea, because unlike most bigotries, there were literal physiological differences between species that could be weaponized to fuel bigotry. Despite the unification, each of the four kingdoms' core demographic in its population was the species for which it was named. So this, I think, is a really interesting thing that I've never seen anything talk about besides Homestuck.
Yeah, they try to do allegories of racism by doing species and stuff, but they never go full into the fact that, no, these are literally completely different physiological people.
Yeah, there's actually this like racism fallacy. I don't know if there's a name for it, but maybe there should be. But we spend so much in our current modern era and our political news and stuff debating about just boring old racism. You ever get the idea that humanity's been stuck on the same issues for like thousands of years for so long that we never actually get to move beyond that to talk about the next question?
Oh yeah,
right.
Mm-hmm. Like what would you do in a post-scarcity society?
Oh yeah, kind of. That's one thing I really love about this. I really love about the transition to Homestuck too. Right. I wish they would have gone more into this instead of skipping over it. Right.
Mm-hmm.
But like, okay, let's talk about racism for example. Right.
Mm-hmm.
There's a fallacy that people don't realize that because a lot of racists try to prove how like white people are just genetically superior to other races, right?
Mm-hmm.
What they don't realize is that even if you did prove that, like let's just say in like one specific way, white people were better than other races, right?
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't automatically translate to you have more of a right to do X than they do.
Yeah, exactly.
What if it turned out that like literally black people lived half as long as white people, for example? That what?
The Hemo spectrum. Because that's literally the case on the Hemo spectrum.
For Charles, right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, no, but if you're from the burgundy to the higher, yes, I get what you mean.
Yeah.
But my point is that even if that was true, black people would still deserve just as much rights as everyone else.
Mm-hmm.
This would be a concern like on physiological matters. And like to a certain extent, this exists with like sexism.
Mm-hmm.
There are some biological differences when it comes to like the binomial gender structure, right?
Mm-hmm.
That like most women, if you're assigned female at birth, you're probably going to have a womb, which will be different than people who don't have a womb.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
There are physiological differences. And so we are currently existing in the muck of people purporting that there are physiological differences that aren't there. White people are not superior, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
But it's interesting to presume that like, if we ever got past that logic, what if we one day did get to a situation where there were more pronounced physiological differences, like with robots or, for example, aliens, like other species, like in Homestuck, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where people could use that excuse and more people would buy it because people would be jumping to the idea that like trolls, for example, right? The Burgundy Bloods only live like what, or like to like in their 20s, right?
I don't know. There's no hard data on any of that. All we know is it goes from decades to millennia.
Okay, decades. We'll say decades.
Yeah.
Burgundy Bloods only live to their decades, right?
Yeah.
And but that doesn't mean that they're any less people, and that doesn't mean they're below you in any way.
Mm-hmm.
So I know. I just think it's an interesting discussion of what if bigotries did have biological foundations for their arguments that weren't total bunk.
Mm-hmm.
And here's the thing: they're still bigotries.
Yeah, exactly.
And so that's what we're getting into the xenophobia here, and I think that's just really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
You have any other comments you want to make on it?
Oh, yeah, I really think that, like, we're so caught up on the stupid bullshit that they peddle right now that we can't even get past that to the point where we're like, yeah, there are physiological differences between us and another species. So what? That doesn't mean they're not sentient. That doesn't mean we shouldn't treat them with the basic human decency.
I'd also be, I would feel like we missed a piece of this conversation if I didn't bring up trans people.
Oh, yeah.
Because trans people often get like the word biological thrown at them to oppress them a lot, right?
Mm-hmm.
because people try to purport, oh, well, there are biological differences, not realizing that like differences in hormone levels and testosterone and musculature and whatnot is a thing that already varies among cis people, much less when you add trans people to it.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's a way of like cherry picking the data to support a biological essentialism argument.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, let's get back to the Homestuck alien xenophobia stuff.
Yep. Xenophobia often took the form of human supremacy, an idea that took root in the ideas that most of the surviving Spur players were humans, and that Earthsea had originally been populated only by humans. Which is not true. They had Carapacians with them.
And before that? Only humans.
Well, no, they had the mayor and PM with them on the Victory platform.
Okay, Earth B2, Earthsea.
I see. Okay, fine. Other bigotries like racism fell to a lesser importance among bigots in favor of xenophobia.
Yeah, so I think having an allegory to racism is still okay with speciesism or xenophobia, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think having that analogy is perfectly fine. It's just the physiological difference thing that we were talking about will be a very frequently cited excuse.
Yep.
Xenophobia tended to be falsely benevolent to Carapacians, praising them for tending to have longer lifespans, but pitying them for having a lack of reproductive abilities. It affected trolls and consorts much worse, however.
Yes, and also because of the mayor, Carapacians were well respected as part of the government, I assume.
I mean, he probably gave them a bit of clout.
Yeah. Consorts tended to have the shortest lifespans and were often seen as less intelligent, though in reality consorts just tended to want to spend their shorter lives enjoying themselves instead of engaging in academia. However, because they also had the largest population of all the kingdoms, consorts were proportionally less represented in the house out of all the species, since all kingdoms were given an equal quarter.
Yeah, a lot of times they talk about consorts being less intelligent, and if you're trying to say like, oh, well, different species have different intelligent levels, I think that's supposed to be like, oh, it's just a biological fact, just like how some are taller, some are a different color, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think you can prove that.
Yeah.
Because that requires the false idea that like intelligence tests are a real thing.
Yeah, which is like, it's not really something you can measure.
Yeah,
it
like
just isn't.
The concept of intelligence is so nebulous and kind of made up.
Mm-hmm.
I understand that sometimes you want to just use the word smarter, but you're always doing that in relation to something, right? Like, you are more well-read in this book, or this math, or science, or academia, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the idea, like, consorts, they can speak, they can think, they're clearly, like, capable of speech and emotion. So to say that they're less intelligent, I think, is kind of ignorant, to be honest.
Yeah.
And if they do seem, like, less inclined into academia, well, fine, they're less inclined to academia. It doesn't mean they're less intelligent.
Yeah, exactly.
And also, remember what I was saying about one kingdom having more of a population? That hurts the consorts the most.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Oh, by the way, in case you haven't listened to the previous episodes, the consorts are like basically sapient amphibians.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them are salamanders, some are iguanas, some are crocodiles, and some are turtles.
Okay.
So, amphibious reptiles.
Mm-hmm.
Trolls were seen as the most alien out of the species, particularly since they were nocturnal, unlike the other diurnal species. Bigots would fearmonger about trolls, citing Alternian prehistory as a precedent for what they claimed to be a biological fact that trolls were monsters. This fearmongering eventually led to ectobiological reproduction for all species to become regulated by the DOJ, but trolls were particularly unhappy about that.
Mm-hmm. I feel like they're naturally nocturnal, but enough of them adapted to the diurnal pattern that you see trolls around during the day.
Yeah, but that's no different than how humans can do the night shift.
Yeah, true. Fair enough. Because in one of the comics we read, they go to a troll cafe during the day, and the troll cafe has a bunch of trolls in there, and it's open during the day.
Just like you can go to an all-night diner, though.
Yeah, true. Ultimately, however, xenophobia was not seen as a debilitating issue to be taken seriously, and even the idea was so socially unacceptable that it was not a position openly taken. Instead, the idea festered underneath Earthsea society.
Yeah, fortunately, that will never ever come up again, obviously. I'm being facetious. Obviously, like, this is paralleling racism, right? Where there was a chunk of American history where it's like, I'm obviously not racist. And then, like, oh, you obviously were. It's just racist in policy. Like, people don't realize, like, President Nixon in the real world was the man who invented the idea of, like, I'm going to be overtly racist just without using the word racist in my politics. Anyway, the year 1852. Slowly over time, changes were made to the government of Earthsea, as it slowly concentrated more power into itself and away from the PLU. Eventually, the position of mayor was replaced with president, as an acknowledgement of how much agency the elected leader had come to have.
Despite the government...
Wait. That's why I said don't have the leader office.
Yeah.
Even when it's ceremonial.
Yeah, I know.
Who knows if it'll stay that way?
Yep.
Which, again, parallels the real world United States presidency.
I know. Despite the government's accrual of power, societal norms kept presidents and the House in check for the time being. Society in Earthsea continued onwards relatively peacefully.
Again, playing government, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But 2013, eventually, the creators arrived. 5,000 years since they had left Earthsea. They were welcomed back as figures of legend to much applause, and the people were so excited for the creators to return that the Four Kingdoms coronated many of them as royalty, though the positions were purely symbolic and held absolutely no power.
Mm-hmm. John, Jane, Mr. Crocker, and both Nana sprites chose to live in the human kingdom, and so John and Jane were coronated as king and queen. The fact that only human creators chose to live in the human kingdom was not lost upon the people.
Foreshadowing.
Mm-hmm.
Dave, Jade, Karkat, and Terezi chose to live in the Troll Kingdom, and they were all four coronated as kings or queens. The fact that both human and troll creators were given these positions was a testament of solidarity against xenophobia in the Troll Kingdom.
Rose, Roxy, Kanaya, and Calliope chose to live in the Carapacian Kingdom. Rose and Roxy were coronated as Dursite queens, and Kanaya and Calliope were coronated as Prospitian queens. None of the creators were Carapacians, but the Carapacian Kingdom had the most diverse royalty, complete with the only known cherub.
Calliope was the cherub, by the way.
Yeah.
She's a green skull monster.
Mm-hmm.
Jake, Dirk, and G. Catavro sprite chose to live in the Consort Kingdom, and so Jake and Dirk were coronated as kings. Again, none of the creators were consorts, but Jake and Dirk were particularly beloved by the consorts immediately.
The creators were treated like celebrities, but the Spur players that had died and never arrived were still remembered in lore. However, there were some creators that had survived but not arrived on Earthsea, specifically Aradia, Friska, Gamzee, Mina, and Depeta Squared still lived on in Paradox space somewhere, sometime, at least for a while. They simply hadn't chosen to come to Earthsea, but instead fought Lord English to secure its safety.
However, several other sprites that arrived with the rest of the creators left the global spotlight soon after their arrival, choosing to instead live quiet lives now that their purpose of guidance in Spurb was complete. These sprites included Jespero Sprite Squared, Jasper Sprite, Aerosol Sprite, and both Aarqueus sprites. For the record, that's just the best explanation we can come up with, since they just do not appear in the story after that point, with like one exception. And it's genuinely annoying. It's like, what was the purpose of creating those characters? And then just like not explaining it, like, we don't even know, like, the mortality. Do sprites die of old age? We don't know!
Yep. The creators began to settle into life on Earthsea, and individually began to pursue their passions in life. John, however, came to regret choosing the human kingdom, And he moved to live in an alchemized duplicate of his old home in the Consort Kingdom.
Terezi, feeling strangely lonely, quickly left Earthsea through a fenestrated plane to re-enter Paradox Space in the hopes of finding Vriska and bringing her home.
Rose published many books, including her previous copies of Complacency of the Learned, as well as her
Learned.
Including her previous copies of Complacency of the Learned, as well as her lore journals that gave far more detail about the lore of Spurb and the prehistories of Bephoris, Alternia, Earth B1, and Earth B2 than any information Earthsea had acquired prior. While Rose's journals were incredibly accurate due to her godly status as the Seer of Light, she purposefully omitted Jas Rose Sprite Squared from the record out of shame.
Because Just Rose Sprite Squared was a more flirtatious, open, and vibrant version of Rose that kind of made her feel a little bit ashamed to have like an alternate version of herself just putting herself out there.
Yeah.
2014. Rose and Kanaya got married, but there was an incident during the wedding involving the guest creators using trickster lollipops that was seen as racially insensitive among the human kingdom.
Jake and Dirk started several television shows that became incredibly successful, especially in the Consort Kingdom. Jikatavro Sprite was a regular guest.
Yeah, in the credits, you see Jikatavro Sprite going on, doing some escapades with them. But in the epilogues and Homestuck 2, you just never see him again.
Yeah.
Again, the Sprite thing is so annoying to me. 2015. Jane, with the support of Dirk and her father, Mr. Crocker, ran for political office as a local mayor of her town. In her position, she loosened regulations to allow for the formation of private companies. She soon after founded her new company, Crocker Corp., which specialized in selling alchemized tech.
And then she was CEO of Crocker Corp.
Yeah, because that was her company. And you notice that was also the company that like the Condess ran on Earth B2.
Yeah.
And so Jane spent her whole life growing up thinking she'd own the company. So when she gets, her utopian afterlife kind of situation going on here, she's like, well, I'll do it. I'll make my own company. Who cares if companies are inherently unethical?
As Jane gained more notoriety for her political actions, private companies became more common. Jake incorporated his television shows under his new company, Skyanet.
He did the same thing.
Yeah, which spent most of its time advertising Jake's sexual appeal now that he was 18.
Yeah, like butts on advertisements, that kind of thing.
Yep.
He's considered like the biggest model on the entirety of Earthsea at this point, too.
Yeah.
2016. Dave and Karkat began living together, though Jade lived with them half the time as well. The other half of the time, she stayed at other people's homes as she explored her interspecies sexuality.
Yep.
I'm okay with Jade becoming, so promiscuous. I'm fine with that.
Kanaya finally hatched the matriorb into the first mother grub, and she and Rose began a program to allow trolls to reproduce naturally. They operated in the brooding caverns beneath the Troll Kingdom, beginning the first generation of naturally born trolls.
Calliope began having complicated feelings on gender and sexuality, and they decided that gender didn't make much sense for a cherub. Calliope began having complicated feelings on gender and sexuality, and they decided that gender didn't make much sense for a cherub. Calliope transitioned to be non-binary, but also developed a crush on Roxy, though Roxy had trouble reciprocating the crush because she also had a crush on John. Nevertheless, the people of the Carapacian Kingdom adored Roxy and Calliope's relationship immensely.
Yeah.
So this is a thing that, it's hard to talk about trans characters when referring to their gender, when you're doing a type of, chronological historical context.
Yep.
Particularly in a story that has so much time travel, paradox loops, and alternate timelines. For example, this version of Calliope becomes non-binary, but there's another version that remains she, her. Right?
Yeah.
So, we're just trying to take the tact of we'll use the appropriate pronouns for the version of the character that we're currently talking about. We hope our listeners understand.
Yeah. 2017.
Oh, and yeah, the Carapacians basically ship Roxy and Calliope, even though, they're not officially together.
2017. John began isolating himself as he struggled to know what to do with his life with no evil to vanquish. He missed his father and cut himself off from world events to avoid seeing Jane on the news with Mr. Crocker, the alternate version of John's deceased father.
That must have been so difficult, right?
Yeah,
Because
to see him and Jane on TV and have them be all father-daughter.
We do get to see a scene of John reuniting with his father, but it's Mr. Crocker instead of Mr. Egbert. It's the alternate universe version, right?
Mm-hmm.
But Dad, Mr. Crocker, he doesn't go "Oh, my boy, John, how's it going?" He goes, "Pop-up? Is that you? You're young now."
Mm-hmm.
Because his dad thinks of John as his dad instead of the other way around.
Yeah.
So while it was a sweet reunion, I feel like it just makes John feel kind of complicated inside.
Yeah.
It makes him miss his real father.
Yep. Caliborn, the spur player from Session C with his associate Gamzee, contacted John for the last time, demanding a final challenge before he became Lord English. But John just destroyed his phone to prevent Caliborn from contacting him ever again.
Yeah, it was creepy to know that he could have done that. It's it's like an echo from your past trying to contact you because of time shenanigans, right?
Mm-hmm.
Over the next few years, 2 of the God Tier creators learned that there was a power beyond the God Tiers called the Ultimate Self. Dirk was the first to realize it, and he chose to undergo it alone. He continued to live his life as Jake's heel on his television shows and building robots as a personal hobby, but it was all an act to cover his absolute crisis of identity. It actually is kind of tragic what happened to Dirk. I genuinely feel it's the kind of thing where someone sabotages themselves, you know?
Mm-hmm.
He did choose to go through it alone. He could have told somebody, and he just didn't.
Mm-hmm. Eventually, Dirk, the Prince of Heart, reached his ultimate self without anyone noticing. Every splinter of his personality became accessible within his mind, with all of their personalities merging. The memories of Dirk, Bro, Lil Hal, Arqueus, Brain Ghost Dirk, and every name by which any version of Dirk had ever been known became part of the single entity known as Ultimate Dirk. Even if alternate versions of Dirk were still out there somewhere, Dirk now knew their experiences intimately.
There's even an argument to be made that Doc Scratch counts as an alternate version of Dirk.
Because of how he was created.
Exactly.
Yep.
Unfortunately, most versions of Dirk were arrogant, narcissistic misanthropes obsessed with using irony as an excuse for their abuse. Even though this Dirk had made much personal, emotional progress by reuniting with Dave, the sheer amount of Dirk drowned out the nice personality with one that became obsessed with the narratives of Homestuck. As Ultimate Dirk, he could see the narration and structure of the story itself, and he was horrified that it was ending. He began making extremely complex plans to avoid that, which included pushing Jane's political ambitions.
Mm-hmm. Rose, the Seer of Light, was the other creator realizing her ultimate self. However, she fought against it because she was scared of becoming something that would be incapable of loving the life she had, particularly Kanaya. She grew gravely ill and plagued by constant visions, and her illness worried all of the creators, especially Kanaya.
Rose and Kanaya are the best relationship in Homestuck.
I know. Rosemary.
Lesbians. Jade became sexually promiscuous and polyamorous, and she spread a philosophy about how the quadrant system of love, which had been adopted by most people on Earthsea, should be rejected in favor of free love. I really like this because, the quadrant system of love that Homestuck introduces was something that was, I think, really vital for me personally, kind of opening my mind about, what love could even be.
Mm-hmm.
And so I love the idea that one of the characters comes back and goes that system's still kind of limiting. Just abolish love systems.
Yeah, because when you first met me, you were looking for a friend, otherwise known as a Moirail.
Well, not a friend, a Moirail. That's different.
Yeah, okay, whatever. But Yeah.
Yeah, and it's just like
We
even
ended
that
up becoming this.
yeah, even that system's limiting.
Yeah. Jane's influence as both a political and corporate figure began to spread as she loosened regulations around Earthsea, trying to bring an implicit system of capitalism to a society that lacked a proper currency through private ownership. Her xenophobia towards trolls was evident in her lopsided policies that favored humans, resulting in exacerbating the xenophobia already present in Earthsea.
Jane's rhetoric was correlated to an increase in human representation among the DOJ and House, with the Human Kingdom's representatives being nearly entirely composed of humans. Meanwhile, the capitalist economic policies severely weakened the PLU's political power, which had seen a steady decline for a while now, but private ownership made negotiations for the PLU always be an uphill battle with the DOJ.
Dave became politically active and started to warn anyone who would listen about how Jane was using neoliberal austerity measures to erode the stability of Earthsea society. Karkat empathized with Dave, but felt the xenophobic oppression and regulation of troll reproduction was a more pressing issue than economics.
Yeah, Dave's the economic leftist socialist kind of guy, or sock dem really.
Yeah.
And then Karkat's the very leftist identity politics guy,
Yeah.
and where that goes will depend.
Yeah, but they agree with each other.
Oh yeah, they just reflect different sides of the coin effectively.
Mm-hmm.
As the creators matured and became more involved in society in various political ways, political factions in the Four Kingdoms shifted considerably. The most notable change was a resurgence in the Carapacian Kingdom's monarchist party that hoped to roll back democracy to a constitutional monarchy. Many in the party specifically supported monarchism so that, if one of the creators won the presidency against the people of the Carapacian Kingdom's wishes, they could be ruled by one of their coronated queens. So it's very weird, but basically, monarchism is an awful, horrible, terrible idea, right?
Yes.
Anyone supporting monarchism in the modern day and age is a totalitarian, effectively.
Yes, but Carapacians are basically chess people, so monarchism is practically ingrained into them.
Yeah, think of them as you do British people, right? A lot of British people have this reverence for the monarchy that makes no sense to anyone else.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just an unquestioned bias that they have because it's so seeped into their culture.
Yeah,
right?
The Carapacians are like that.
Yes. However, there is a point that the Carapacians have.
Yeah,
if the supposedly democratically elected president of Earthsea turned out to be a horrible totalitarian, the monarchists were wanting to switch back to being ruled by the Prospitian and Dursite queens, right? They would have an argument that their totalitarian that they chose to coronate might be a lesser evil than a president that was chosen.
Yes, and see, that's important because it's they don't want, it's not that they don't want a president at all, but they're worried about one of the creators becoming president.
A god.
Yes, because basically having a god as president, who's going to oppose them?
Well, that's kind of what they're saying.
Who's going to actually put those checks on the presidency if they're one of the creators of this world?
Yeah, you think the House is going to restrict their power at that point?
Yeah, exactly. They're just going to do whatever the creator wants.
So the monarchists are saying, well, if a creator is going to be in charge, we at least want to have it be one of our own.
Yes, because they trust Roxy and Calliope implicitly.
And Kanaya and
Rose.
Yes.
Yes.
So I could see the argument there, but obviously the philosophy of monarchism is complete bunk.
Yeah. 2020. By this time, Dirk and Jane had curried much favor with the 20th president of Earthsea and the House to pass laws increasing voter suppression using the fear of inter-kingdom voter fraud, as well as redistricting the voter districts into being extremely gerrymandered. The Consort Kingdom's districts were distorted and gerrymandered the most to give preferential treatment to the districts that favored the political parties that aligned with human supremacy. An additional benefit to the strategy was that consorts became quickly disillusioned with voting, lowering their turnout rate and representation in the House.
Remember how your representation is determined by voter turnout rate?
Yeah.
So if someone abuses the system this way, disillusions the voter base, you give a flat reduction to their power in the House.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
That's awful.
Mm-hmm. Of course it's Dirk and Jane doing that.
I'm sorry. I forgot to put something.
What?
Dirk then suggested that Jane run for presidential office in the next term, and Jane was happy to pursue that to increase the power of her company. She chose a prominent troll politician named Ataxia as her running mate for vice president to superficially appeal to diversity, despite the fact that Ataxia was extremely unpopular in the Troll Kingdom for proposing limits on troll reproduction.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, this is just like it's like Kamala Harris.
Yeah, I know.
And this was written before that.
Yeah.
Well, okay, during, I guess, yeah. They saw the writing on the wall.
Meanwhile, Rose had a severe realization from her visions. Lord English had never been defeated. No one had delivered the Juju weapon that defeated him. Causality had a plot hole. Despite her grave illness, she called for John, who finally left isolation for the sake of his friend. She asked that he use his retcon powers to zap back to the fight with Lord English with specific instructions, but she refused to demand he do this.
Rose left the decision to John, and John had a picnic with Roxy and Calliope as they waited to see what he would decide. Calliope offered John 2 options for his meal.
Meat or candy?
And that's where it leaves off.
Yep.
Because effectively, the choice that John makes here, meat or candy...
splits off the timeline into the meat and candy timelines, which are completely separate and have a ton of events on their own, and we'd have to go over them separately.
Yeah. I'd like to, at the risk of doing a spoiler, I'd like to just give a little bit of a teaser for how different the 2 outcomes are, okay?
Okay.
Because I think Karkat's the perfect representation of that.
Okay.
Right? In one timeline, Karkat runs for president. In another one, he leads a revolution.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll see how this goes.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk about the meat and candy stuff in their own episodes, right?
Mm-hmm.
The problem, however, is Homestuck 2, which takes place in the meat and candy universes, is not yet finished.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, we do have some bad news. Homestuck 2 is currently paused. They're on a hiatus in development.
Yeah.
And their reasoning is because they've received a ton of hate from people that were supposedly their fans.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, as Homestuck fans, we can attest to this.
Yeah.
We've had people that hated us just for talking about identity politics and like economics and crap in Homestuck. Turning a critical eye to it. There's a lot of people that hate Homestuck 2. They've always hated Homestuck. There's some that hate Homestuck 2, but they claim to like the original one. I think it's fine to be critical to all of it, but in my opinion, the original Homestuck had a lot more problematic things. Homestuck 2 is far more progressive. Mm-hmm. It's far less problematic.
Yeah.
I mean, there's still things here and there, obviously, but I know there was always that toxic segment of Homestuck there. There was always those rumors of like, oh, those really toxic Homestuck fans that go to the cosplay conventions and harass people by being in character, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I don't think those people ever really went away. Sadly, I think what's happened is a lot of the really nice Homestuck fans, they retired. They moved on with their life. They went to other things. That happens. Mm-hmm. But the toxic people are a very vocal minority that chose to make hating Homestuck their thing.
Yeah.
And I do think there's a lot of people that try, like, as soon as Homestuck 2 came out, they're like, oh, well, look, I'm not unreasonable. I liked Homestuck 1 as a way to excuse their toxicity.
Yeah, which is like, yikes.
I think these people are very much Homestuck haters, not really fans. Yeah. They're the Caliborns, not the Calliopes. So I really find it sad that those people were able to harass the creators of Homestuck 2 to the point where they want to be less transparent with their development. The rest of Homestuck 2 will apparently still come eventually, but it's going to be a while. And I really hate the toxic Homestuck people. If you're listening to this, please try to be better. You can criticize the content of Homestuck. We do it all the time. And still appreciate it and care about it and just not be a jerk about it.
Yeah. Homestuck will always be one of the most special fandoms and things in our lives. Because it's how we met each other.
Yeah, and again,
we will always love it.
Yeah, I don't think this represents the majority of Homestuck fans.
Yeah.
I just think Homestuck's been going on long enough with enough giant pauses in between its development that a lot of the nicest Homestuck fans are just kind of quietly Homestuck fans.
And they're also all adults.
And a lot of them are trans.
Yeah.
Like, let's be real. Like, a lot of people found themselves.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, I envy that.
Yeah.
What?
Nothing.
You can say it.
You're such a fucking egg.
Thanks. Anyway, I think we should wrap it up by now. We're not exactly sure if we're going to do a Mean Candy episode like soonish, or if we're going to wait until Homestuck 2 is finished, or at least there's more progress.
I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah. We'll probably have one more Homestuck episode following up on this just to talk about the characters, just as kind of a send-off to Homestuck for now, until eventually there's more for us to cover.
Yeah. All right. So, I'm Kira.
Oh, sorry. And I wanted to say just to the developers of Homestuck, Hussey and your team and everything, What Pumpkin, thank you so much for all your work. We really appreciate that you've made an attempt to be more diverse in like trans representation. There's an intersex character. There's some I guess furry stuff. And again, not all of it has been great. A lot of people found the Jade situation to be kind of weird, but I still would much rather have flops of attempts than no attempts at all.
Yeah, and just know that your creation brought people together.
Yeah.
I mean, we both. I met the love of my life because of Homestuck.
Me too.
So yeah.
All right. Well, till next time.
Mm-hmm.
Bye.
Bye.